The Knicks are the team that I believe and have believed since the beginning of the season with unwavering conviction will be the best team in the Eastern Conference and go to the NBA Finals. And they've looked like it as well, like recently. But I think there's a really micro narrative that probably won't get talked about very much. That is probably the most important aspect of this matchup, of this individual game. You mentioned Stephon Castle, De'Aaron Fox. These are two of the best at getting into the teeth of your defense in the entire NBA. If the Knicks can keep those two guards out of the paint, they will win the game because the Spurs won't be able to score with them. If the Knicks can't keep those two guards out of the paint, the Knicks are probably going to lose by double-digit points, I assume.
The Spurs didn't shoot well. Like, you can't beat OKC on a neutral court shooting 29% from three, getting 1 of 13 from Champagnie and Barnes. To do that is the sign of a team that can, at an elite level, control what you can control. I think that the Spurs will attempt an extremely exploitative coverage in the sense of you can live with the volatility of these open Josh Hart shots. And this is why I think it is a super important game for him.
This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host, XJ. As always, I'm joined by my brilliant co-host, Geoff. And Geoff, we have quite the NBA Cup matchup coming up, and we absolutely had to do a preview about it with our unique perspective, breaking it down from a Hot Hand Theory lens. The New York Knicks versus the San Antonio Spurs. First of all, the semifinals games were incredible. Stan Van Gundy kept talking about on the broadcast how the NBA has to be so happy. And if you're not enjoying this, maybe you just don't even like basketball. And I'd have to concur with that. The games have been, those two games at least were incredible games. But we ended up with, I think, a surprise for most people, not having the Knicks versus the Thunder, which is what was sort of expected coming into it. We have the Knicks versus the Spurs, but Wembanyama coming back really made a huge difference in terms of that expectation. He looked like he had not missed any games. He was fully fresh, especially on the defensive end, hugely impactful. The Knicks are the team that I believe and have believed since the beginning of the season with unwavering conviction will be the best team in the Eastern Conference and go to the NBA Finals. And they've looked like it as well, like recently, albeit earlier than I've anticipated. They are 9-1 in their last 10. An important caveat is that they were favorites in each and every one of those 10 games, so they were expected to win all those games. This will be their first true test against the Spurs with Wembanyama, who played 21 minutes in this most recent game against the Thunder. Maybe in this championship, at least in the cup terms, level game, that'll extend out to 25 to 30 minutes. But this will be their first true test aside from the Boston Celtics that, in a game that they play without OG Anunoby, who, if you don't know, is a completely inexorable part of their defense and is pretty much literally their defense. They're 11 points better defensively when he plays. The Spurs are about 14 points defensively better when Wembanyama plays, so there's a similar relationship there. This is an interesting matchup. There's very many angles to break this down from, and we're going to cover all of them. And if you're listening to this, you are going to be more prepared than you could possibly imagine to watch this game and to know what to expect. Geoff, where do you want to start with breaking down the matchup between the Knicks and the Spurs? And let's get it going from there.
Yeah, that was such a good and thorough intro. You always do such a good job, but that one just kind of just caught me off guard. Almost just super good. You're so right. Both of those games were so high quality, especially Spurs Thunder. And when the Spurs beat the Lakers, I was watching that game with a little interest, and I just spent the whole game thinking they are destroying the Lakers, but this is, especially without Wemby, this is almost ridiculous. They're making all these shots. I don't know what I'm supposed to take from this game because I don't know if this is the Spurs. Like, Champagnie is a great shooter. Barnes is a great shooter. Vassell's a really good shooter. And I'm not saying they don't have shooting, but that game seemed like an outlier of an outlier. They go into this Thunder game And I thought Castle early on did an amazing job of getting into the teeth of the OKC defense in a way that not many are able to against that specific defense. And they weren't making the shots that he was creating. They were 0 for their first 12 from 3. And I remember thinking, even before they got down 16 points, Wemby hadn't even come into the game yet. And I just remember thinking that, like, they're creating really, really good shots against a defense that you're not supposed to be able to create really, really good shots versus. And if you believe in process over results like I do, it felt like they were going to be able to turn it around early in that game. And I didn't think they were going to win. I'd be lying if I said, oh, the Spurs are going to win this game. But it did feel like when it was 37-21, the Spurs are playing better than the scoreboard reflects. Then Wemby comes in. Obviously, the tide shifts. And I guess my overarching point is it's the same as when we covered the Spurs earlier this season. This is a team that's being slept on, in my opinion, by the majority in terms of how good they are right this second. And I truthfully could not be more excited for this matchup against the Knicks because, like you said, the Knicks are playing amazing basketball. This is going to be high quality. The Spurs are looking to push the pace in a way that is going to test the Knicks' ability to get back in transition. That's something that they did against the Lakers. The Lakers, obviously, with LeBron and Luka, are slow getting back in transition, and the Spurs were pushing off of every miss. But then it's easier to get back in transition when you're scoring all the time. Guess who has the best offense in the NBA, or the second best offense in the NBA? This is such an interesting matchup because instead of being like a styles make fights, you have these opposites. You almost have these inflection points where if a certain thing goes one way, i.e. maybe the Knicks have some negative variance from shooting, maybe they just don't have it going in a way like we saw against the Magic last night, well, it could tip really hard in one way where the Spurs are running and gunning and then they get going. But then on the other end of the spectrum, maybe the Knicks do get their offense going and, okay, that kind of kneecaps the Spurs transition. Now all of a sudden the Spurs are operating in the half court. They're going to lean on Castle more. This is just an amazing matchup. More than anything, it's just super exciting. This final it's one of the best potential finals, in my opinion, if you're talking East versus West, two teams that are just going to make for a really, really interesting matchup.
Yeah, that was all really well said. And something that you said really piqued my attention, and it ties into something that I've been thinking a lot about. And we're going to watch this matchup, the Spurs versus the Knicks. It's going to be about Wemby and Jalen Brunson, the two stars, maybe some Karl-Anthony Towns, some of the young talent that the Spurs have. That's what the broader narratives are going to be about. But I think there's a really micro narrative that probably won't get talked about very much. That is probably the most important aspect of this matchup, of this individual game. If we were to think of this as like an NBA Finals Game 7 kind of situation, and it's the fact of what you said, where you talked about Castle getting into the teeth of the defense, especially against OKC, a defense that you're not supposed to be able to do that against. A team that you are supposed to be able to do that against, and what everybody is able to do that against, is the New York Knicks defense. The New York Knicks defense, there's been a lot of, from Knicks fan standpoint and NBA watchers standpoint, especially ones who aren't watching super closely this season, a lot about Karl-Anthony Towns and his defense and how, they'll never be able to win with Karl-Anthony Towns as their 5. And, you need a rim protecting defender in that position, all those kinds of things. And maybe you need a rim protecting defender, not because Karl-Anthony Towns is not good enough, but because offenses are just living in the paint against the New York Knicks. They get right by the perimeter defenders that the Knicks have, who happen to be guys like Jalen Brunson, one of the worst, Jordan Clarkson, one of the worst, Tyler Kolek, who has played really, really well offensively, one of the worst at containing guys on the perimeter. And guess who the Spurs have on their team? You mentioned Stephon Castle, De'Aaron Fox. These are two of the best at getting into the teeth of your defense in the entire NBA. In terms of drives per game, they're two of the elite guys in the league, both top 20 in drives per game across the league. In terms of speed, we all know De'Aaron Fox is one of the fastest, quickest players in the entire NBA who can get past pretty much anybody one-on-one. The Knicks also are missing their two best guys potentially at containing faster, smaller guards on the perimeter. Obviously, Deuce McBride and Landry Shamet, who's played really excellent defense this season when he's been on the court. Mikal Bridges is excellent defensively, but more in that free safety kind of roaming around in the backfield, in the backcourt kind of, the front court kind of situation. But not playing on ball and keeping guys in front of him. And OG Anunoby, who is obviously excellent, better at guarding wings in that situation, not these super fast blur speed guards that the Spurs have. And so I think that is going to be the biggest thing to watch. If the Knicks can keep those two guards out of the paint, they will win the game because the Spurs won't be able to score with them. If the Knicks can't keep those two guards out of the paint, the Knicks are probably going to lose by double-digit points, I assume. And I know that feels like a big claim. That I think the Knicks, we talked about this right before we jumped on, the Knicks are opening as favorites to win the game. I just think that this is the biggest factor that I can think of. And it has been the one biggest defensive weakness for this Knicks team is paint penetration. Even in this Magic game, there was at some point Mike Brown had a Kolek, Brunson, Clarkson lineup out there. And I was like, no, I can't watch. Like, no, I like avert your eyes. Luckily, I think Jalen Suggs was already kind of hobbling at that point, and they really didn't have a player to take advantage of it, of that lineup configuration. But it's going to be a problem. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's an excellent shout. And it's the type of thing where I think it's counterintuitive to most people because you would think that a game like the one you're describing where the Spurs are scoring a lot, it's a race almost. It's fast paced, high scoring. That would lend itself to the in a vacuum better offensive team, right? But I do agree with you that if it's the type of game where the Spurs are not taking the ball out of the basket a lot, they're getting out and running, and then in the half court, Bridges, Hart, Kolek, Clarkson, Brunson, these guys that are going to take up the majority of the minutes on the perimeter defensively for the Knicks, if they're not containing the ball handlers, that just spells trouble for the Knicks, and it spells enough trouble that it doesn't seem like there's enough points for them to make up for it. Like, what are they going to do is score 140 points? And I just want to highlight again, because we talked about, the Spurs maybe being slept on a little bit. One of the reasons I brought up that Laker game is because just stuff like that happens in the modern NBA for every team. You look across the board, you have these shooting performances, and it's just like, yeah, that's going to happen. It happens more frequently for the better shooting team, but it just happens. What they just did against OKC doesn't happen. Obviously, OKC is 24-2, so like beating them already doesn't happen. But if you beat OKC this season, and there will be 8, 10, however many losses they're going to take, my guess is the majority of those losses will come because the team just shot well. They had a performance like the Spurs had against the Lakers. The Spurs didn't shoot well. Like, you can't beat OKC on a neutral court shooting 29% from three, getting 1 of 13 from Champagnie and Barnes. To do that is the sign of a team that can, at an elite level, control what you can control. That is a huge, huge compliment to the way the coach is deploying the players, to the strategies he's running outside of creating threes, to their best player, Victor Wembanyama, who, how many players in the league can go up against OKC, play 21 minutes and win those minutes by over 20 points in a game that Alex Caruso on the other side was also plus 20 off the bench? Like, the deck was stacked against Wemby, and he was super impactful in limited minutes. This is just all of these things are being highlighted in this game against OKC, and that's what the Knicks have to take on. They have to figure out a way to keep Castle and Fox out of the paint. And then, boom, you figure that out. In comes Victor Wembanyama. This is just going to be a super, super high-level matchup.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about kind of imagining this style of play where, Castle and Fox are living in the paint and they're scoring at will, and then the Knicks are kind of running. And the Knicks don't run that often in terms of transition. And additionally, in terms of frequency of transition, guess who's 98th percentile in the entire NBA in terms of when he's on the court, teams run less often than when he's off the court. Victor Wembanyama. Victor Wembanyama is not only a half-court stopper, he also ends your ability to run in transition because you can't run off of live rebounds when he's on the court. Because it takes so many people to ensure that they're getting rebounds defensively before you can even like get the ball and run. So he changes the whole dynamic of the game. I don't think that there's going to be a ton of transition, and I think it's going to be a lower scoring game, although I believe Castle and Fox will be able to probably score in these like, paint touch drive situations out of the half court. So that's going to be a tough dynamic for the Knicks to win. I think a big factor and something that's going to be a huge test from the Knicks standpoint is going to be like, can they win a lower scoring game? Like, can they do that? Can they win on the defensive end? Can Mitchell Robinson be this Wembanyama stopper in some ways that he has seemed like he could be in the past? But this Mitchell Robinson that we've seen this season, I don't know about you guys and Knicks fans who are watching this. I'd love to know what you think. Are you panicking about what we're seeing from Mitchell Robinson this season? If you want to leave a comment, I'd love to respond to that, because if we talked about this in an earlier episode that we did on the Knicks. This is concerning from Mitchell Robinson. To me, you have to go get a center. You have to go get a center. This is not the same defensive Mitchell Robinson. He had 4 blocks against the Orlando Magic. I don't think he was like dominant defensively. And he hasn't been in a while. He doesn't move his feet extremely well. One of the blocks that he got was like basically he was beat, and then his player had to kind of like make the guy who beat him offensively had to kind of like take a long route to the rim that allowed him to recover and get the block. But it wasn't because it was a great defensive play. It was just because like incidentally he was able to recover and get the block, not of his own greatness offensively, but I mean defensively. But I don't know. This is very concerning. And for you to win a defensive game, I think you need Mitchell Robinson to be the Mitchell Robinson that we know he can be, the dominant defensive force. And if there was a game where you're like, hey, we need elite Mitch to be able to have a great chance at winning this one, it's going to be against Victor Wembanyama, because if there's anyone kind of engineered and structured to be able to beat, to defend Wembanyama in the entire NBA almost, who would it be other than like a prime defensive Mitchell Robinson? Like, I can't even think of another person who would be better tailored to do that. So like, can they win this game unless they shoot an insane number from 3, which they will get a ton of 3-point shots. We all know when Wemby's on the court, rim shots go way down, 3-point shots go way up, because that's the only shots you're getting when he's on the court. So unless the Knicks shoot just like 45% from 3 on high volume, can they win this game without like some kind of performance from Mitchell Robinson?
I think you're leaning on OG Anunoby and in a weird way, Karl-Anthony Towns even more. We'll save this for the next time we cover the Knicks on their own, but I'd love to hear you talk more about Towns' defense this year, because I do think that's something that we've talked about off to the side a little bit. It's one of the most common pushbacks or comments we get on this channel, I would argue. Like of all the teams in the NBA and all the conversations we've had, I think that the most common discussion point we get is like, can the Knicks win a championship with Brunson and Towns? Can they get to the highest level with these two flawed defenders? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm just going to say how I feel. I think that the underlying implication there when people say that is that Brunson and Towns are like similar to each other, like all offense, no defense. That's clearly what they're implying. And that just isn't the case. And it's a strange thing to me, because I do think that Brunson, who I think is a better offensive player than Towns, is one of not a very good defender. Like I think he does good things on defense, but his general macro impact as a defender is low. And the question needs to become, how do you build around that? I would argue that the Knicks have insulated him in this environment when they're fully healthy, when they have a bench full of guys who can shoot, like Deuce McBride, like Landry Shamet. I think they've done a great job of surrounding Brunson with guys who can shoot, give him maximum space, allow him to have the ball in his hands because he's by far the best creator. And a big part of that is what Towns is able to do and has been able to do defensively. So, maybe I just sort of spoiled the lead, but I do think that you would do a more effective job than I just did in talking about how Towns is able to, the non-traditional ways as a big man, he's actually able to help this defense. And maybe we'll see it in this championship game against Wemby if Mitchell Robinson isn't able to play more minutes. Maybe they just say, hey, Karl-Anthony Towns, yeah, you're not a rim protector. Well, guess what? Victor Wembanyama is a center who likes to start from the perimeter, and your greatest strength as a defender is your ability to stay in front of people, operating in that environment. Maybe Towns' defense will be highlighted in a way that it hasn't, and Knicks fans and NBA fans will start to appreciate it a little bit more.
I love where you went with that, and I love primarily where you started with that, to be honest, and talking about the trope at this point of, oh, you can never win a championship with Brunson and Towns. And I know tons of people who listen to Hot Hand Theory, who listen to other podcasts will say that, not just Knicks fans, but like NBA fans, again, like from this standpoint of these are two no defense players. You can't just win championships with like two no defense players and, they're just all offense and no defense. That is not the case and has never been the case, because although Brunson tries hard defensively, generates turnovers oftentimes by drawing charges and other kinds of antics that he does defensively, or maybe you could call them tactics. He struggles defensively, and he always has. He's not going to be able to keep guys in front of him. If he's at the point of attack, it's going to be a struggle. And partially based on this fear of Brunson being a poor defender, in a weird way, it makes him a worse defender, because you're so fearful of like, oh my gosh, Jalen Brown is being guarded by Jalen Brunson, send the double. Now you're saying when Jalen Brunson's on the court, you're making his impact worse, because you're saying you're requiring he have help every time he's guarding someone, which now means that he is effectively making you play 5-on-4 or 4-on-3. You're making him a worse defender than he actually is my point. And he's already not very good. So his impact defensively is always going to be even lower. So despite that, I don't think he's a no defense player, but like he has the effect of being effectively a no defense player based on those combined factors. Karl-Anthony Towns, that is not the case. Karl-Anthony Towns has always been essentially an average impact defender throughout his entire career. A large part of that is based on defensive rebounding, which is a part of defense, whether people don't believe that or not. Defensive rebounding is a critical part of defense. And if you don't believe that, then just look at the Houston Rockets offense, and you can see every time they get an offensive rebound, what it does to their offensive rating. Then you'll recognize if they didn't get those offensive rebounds, their offense would be a lot worse. So that clearly shows how important defensive rebounding is. But Karl-Anthony Towns this season has leapt beyond just being like, I'm passable in some ways, not extremely damaging, and can help you via my defensive rebounding. Karl-Anthony Towns, for those who don't know, estimated plus minus is an impact metric that is, highly respected across many circles for one number of impact metrics, and does a pretty good job of estimating, whether you're at least having a positive or negative impact on each side of the court. From a defensive standpoint, Karl-Anthony Towns is 96th percentile in defensive EPM, defensive impact. That is clearly far and away the highest of his career, but it's not just the all-in-one impact that we're looking at. There's something else that we can look at to kind of get a better sense of what he's doing defensively this season. From the standpoint of B-ball indexes, a couple of metrics that B-ball index has, rim protection, which is what it sounds like it is. Karl-Anthony Towns is 92nd percentile in the NBA right now in rim protection. 92nd percentile in the NBA in rim protection. Last season, I remember there was like a viral tweet about players being, 99 of 103 against Karl-Anthony Towns every time that he was the one guarding the rim. I'm obviously exaggerating, but it was something ridiculous like that. And it sounded like a fake stat, but someone purported at the time. 92nd percentile currently in the NBA in rim protection. 96th percentile in something that B-Ball Index calls rim disruption. So that considers everything defensively at the rim, how often they contest shots, the quality of the offensive players that they're guarding in terms of contesting shots, their overall impact through deterrence, activity, disruption, in on-ball situations and help situations. This is not just blocks. This is everything that they do to stop opponents from even getting clean shots off. This is what we think of as Victor Wembanyama and his impact on the game defensively. Karl-Anthony Towns is 96th percentile in the NBA in this metric. So of course we know what he does well: switch onto wings, bigger wings, guys who not guards but bigger wings, and be able to move his feet and stay in front of them. Sometimes he gets called for fouls, which has been part of his struggles. But that just brings me full circle to what you were talking about. If we're saying Karl-Anthony Towns is having, and I'm saying Karl-Anthony Towns is having this very quietly elite impact defensive season that many Knicks fans would have you not believe, and NBA fans who don't watch the Knicks every day would just be in complete denial about it. And then he's able to be in this matchup at sometimes against Victor Wembanyama, who plays like a big wing, maybe a gigantic wing, but a big wing, something that Karl-Anthony Towns is well suited to guard against. Maybe this is an opportunity for him to have an impact in that way, if Mitchell Robinson is not up to the task. So I just loved everything you said, and it just made me kind of go on a rant about it. But yeah, I think that was a great observation.
Thank you. To be fair, it's you were the originator. You're the one who started the train of thought. So per usual, just talking basketball with you has made me smarter as a watcher. I think that is a matchup that obviously you want to worry. You worry a little bit about the foul trouble because Towns' spacing is so important to the Knicks offense. Like just it's not like he's become this defensive stopper. He's a fine defender, but where he is accruing the majority of his impact is offensively. And if you put him on Wembanyama, who's going to draw fouls, who's going to just a brutal matchup for anybody. Like, it's not like we're sitting here saying, oh, Towns is going to shut Wembanyama down. It's just relatively what is the Knicks' best answer. You just kind of have to toe that line pretty interestingly. I think OG Anunoby is another option. But more than anything, I hope people have noted that was the second time, actually, that you have subtly referred to or discussed the idea of this gravity. First, you talked about it with Wembanyama, and then you talked about it with Brunson. And I think it's just always so interesting to talk about that sort of trickle-down effect in the NBA in ways that people don't really think about. And you talked about it with Wembanyama. As an offense, when you're facing Wembanyama, you get out in transition less because if you can't have four guys leak out and one guy go after the defensive rebound with Wemby. He's going to get the offensive rebound and you're done. And then another thing that you didn't refer to, but I think it just is why Wemby has, I said it earlier this season, I think he has the highest ceiling of NBA. He can be the greatest basketball player of all time from an impact perspective. And it's because on the other end of the court, he is just always there when he's on the court. You almost have to rearrange your offense. And this is why the matchup is so interesting, because the places where Wemby is trying to prevent you from getting, Jalen Brunson ain't trying to get there. And so it's like we saw it with SGA. I thought the Spurs did a brilliant job, especially late in the game, of at least making SGA's life tough in terms of not letting him get to his spots. And Stan Van Gundy, who I thought had a really nice night calling this game, he pointed it out. He talked about, look, you're not going to stop SGA. You can't, he's just too good. But what you can do is you can make it harder. And they know the SGA, his quote unquote office, as they like to say, is that mid-range. He loves the mid-range. Sure, he'd like to get to the rim, but when Wemby's on the court, that just isn't really an option. He's just everywhere. And so Brunson's going to be a lot of the same. And to me, it's like, can a guy like Castle stay out of foul trouble on Jalen Brunson and keep Brunson from getting to his spots? Because I think one area Brunson is actually underrated is the way he makes his teammates better by just his mere existence on the court because of how much attention he demands. I think that in the episodes we've discussed the Knicks, I think that I've done a poor job of just properly communicating the respect I think he deserves objectively as an offensive player and his general offensive impact, because I've highlighted that maybe he isn't the pass, not maybe, I know he isn't the overall passer of like a LaMelo Ball or a Tyrese Halliburton, but I don't think he has to be. And I think that when he gets to the spots that he loves and he's operating as efficiently as he is at his best, it bends the defense in a way that only a guy like SGA does better. Maybe a guy like Luka Doncic does. It's really unique. And if the Spurs can prevent him from getting those spots, all of a sudden those quick sprays to OG Anunoby or Mikal Bridges in the corner where they're shooting open threes, shooting slightly open threes, attacking closeouts and getting to the rim, those are going to happen less frequently. Again, it's just another one of those inflection points where if the Spurs can do it, they win the game. If the Spurs can't do it, maybe the Knicks are scoring 130 points again, you know?
Yeah, all great points. And it also really makes me think about the fact that Wembanyama and what you talked about Jalen Brunson and the place that he operates and Wembanyama really trying to deter rim attempts and Jalen Brunson being like, you could have that. I'm not intending to go take those. That's fine. I'm going to shoot it from out here. That definitely provides some advantage for him. But one of the problems that the Knicks are going to run into, and this is, this was bound to come up, and you and I both talked about this extensively over the past couple of years. The Spurs are going to put Wembanyama on Josh Hart, and they're going to say, we're going to have Wembanyama just sit near the rim, and you will get no rim attempts, and any rim attempts you get are going to be extremely low quality, and you're going to shoot 20% lower than your average, rim percentage because you have Josh Hart on the court. Unless Josh Hart continues to shoot aggressively from three and not only shoots them, in this case, makes them, because we're talking about a single game situation. We're not talking about over the course of a series or over the course of a season. We're talking about a single game. And if he doesn't make shots, whether he takes, 7, 8, 9 3-point attempts, if he doesn't make any of them, that's no points. And those are wasted possessions that aren't changing and bending the way that the defense is guarding them. So Josh Hart is going to play. Not having Deuce McBride, I think, is going to be really, really essential for this particular game. And not having Deuce McBride means what I talked about: Stephon Castle, De'Aaron Fox, two of the best players really in the entire NBA at getting into the teeth of the defense, getting past your first perimeter defensive player. They're going to be able to do what they want at will without Deuce McBride, who would have been your best option to slow that down. And then on top of that, you have to play Josh Hart a ton of minutes. You don't have five shooter lineups that you can go to, because when Josh Hart is off the court, probably Mitchell Robinson will be on the court. That's going to be a problem if the Spurs are able to play what we call ghost coverage against Josh Hart and just have Wembanyama sit at the rim. Like, if you are able to have Wembanyama sit at the rim, which he honestly did against the Thunder, and that's guarding guys like Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams. These are great 3-point shooters, and they were still like, we'll get into rotation if we have to, but we're going to leave those guys a little more open than we'd like in order to have Wembanyama somewhere in the vicinity of the rim. They won't even have to worry about that against the Knicks. So what do you do from the Knicks standpoint in that case, if the Spurs play it that way, which I think they will? And if the Knicks are playing 5 shooter lineups, what do the Spurs do as a counter when Wembanyama's on the court?
So I don't think the Knicks will play a ton of 5 shooter lineups in this game. So I think we can stop there. Like, Hart played 31 minutes against the Magic. I think he'll play more against the Spurs. And so it doesn't really leave much wiggle room for no Hart, no Mitch lineups, who are the 2 non-shooters. I think this is a huge game for Josh Hart. And I was prepared. Like I said, I thought the Thunder were going to win this game. And I thought that it would have been a really interesting matchup for the Knicks, because the Thunder would have played ghost coverage the same way that the Spurs are going to, except the Thunder like to do this thing where, like, it's not as exploitative because they are fine, as you pointed out last season, XJ, they are fine with being in rotation. They thrive in rotation. If the Spurs are smart, and I think they are smart, I think that every game I watch the Spurs, I'm respecting Mitch Johnson more and more. I think that the Spurs will attempt an extremely exploitative coverage in the sense of being put in rotation. They won't default to it. It won't be a thing where it's like, okay, Josh Hart's running the offense more. Josh Hart's hitting his open shots. Now we got to hedge a little bit. Now we got to trust our rotation. If they trust the process, Josh Hart is going to have to do a lot to force that adjustment. And it's not going to be a thing where, oh, well, Wemby's kind of sagging off in the paint. We have to, have somebody hedge up Josh Hart setting the screen. We have to find ways to make sure that he's sort of accounted for. You can be a little bit more aggressive and live with the volatility of these open Josh Hart shots. And this is why I think it is a super important game for him, because I think anyone who's followed the Knicks this season has heard the talks about the newfound confidence in the shot, how much he's practicing it, how much the new shooting coach, all of those things. It's sort of coming to a head with this game, because if on a huge stage he can look that ghost coverage in the eye and not only just make open shots, but punish them in different ways, find clever ways to get inside the paint and put himself, not Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart, be the one that puts the team in rotation by getting to the rim in funky ways, use him as a screener, increase his offensive impact by, Wemby sagged off, find those little flare screens. Wemby's not going to be able to get out to the shooter. These are ways Josh Hart can have high offensive impact without touching the ball and without the relying on the variance of his threes going in. There are ways for him to attack the ghost coverage without just, he had a hot shooting night, because, we're going to need a season plus of data and of results to say, yeah, Josh Hart definitely improved as a shooter. Like, he's 30 years old. I'm not saying he definitely didn't improve as a shooter. But what I am saying is that this is an opportunity for him to find ways to impact the game offensively without relying on the make or break it of his shots going in against a super aggressive ghost coverage. And they are going to face it because they're facing a team with probably the best candidate to stick on Josh Hart and live with whatever he's going to do, because he's the best rim protector. He's the best defender at his peak in the entire NBA.
Yeah. And I think to your point, I think that Mitch Johnson is a really good coach. And I think that if he goes away from this strategy, if Josh Hart happens to be on the court when Victor Wembanyama is on the court, I can't see them deviating from this strategy really, no matter what happens. Josh Hart has 2 games in his entire Knicks career with over 8 3-point attempts. Only twice has he ever taken more than 8 threes. And the Knicks lost both games. Those games were against the Celtics and the Warriors, 2 of the more aggressive teams who play this ghost coverage. Obviously, the Celtics, we know, are the most aggressive and have players who do it the best. I've talked about this at length before.
They did it again last time they played him.
Yeah,
I got called out on Twitter. Like, somebody was like, "Oh no, they went away from it. Josh Hart forced them to go away from it." And I was just like, that doesn't sound right to me. I don't remember seeing it. So I went back and watched like the last 6 minutes of the game. And the Celtics, I don't know how Missoula does it, but it's like whoever's on their team.
He's a sicko. Yeah.
Yeah. Whoever's on their team, they are going to live with Josh Hart beating them for the rest of eternity. So
he doesn't care. Missoula would, I think, if you asked him, like, and he would give you one of these straight faced answers where he'd be like, I'd rather die than lose to Josh Hart, to closing out on Josh Hart threes. Like, he's just not going to, like, he doesn't, like, I think he would put his career on that, because it's a principled thing. And as extreme and kind of ridiculous as that sounds, which it does, you have to like if you have these kinds of principles that make up what you believe about the game, you have to live and die with them, or else what are you doing it for? And especially when there's so much support behind it and evidence behind it. And in this case, again, like I said, Josh Hart's only taken over 8 threes in a game twice in his Knicks career. They lost both games, despite one of those games, him going 5 of 9 from 3. They lost by double digits in that game. And that's because, and you and I have talked about this at the extreme, what are the extreme ends of this ghost coverage thing? Like, how many shots does a player have to take and how many makes does a player have to make for it to counteract how much it's damaging that team's offense by having a guy like Victor Wembanyama just be able to sit at the paint and effectively reduce rim shot frequency by like 30% and rim shot making by like 20, 30, 40%. Like, you have to shoot probably 15 to 20 times from 3 and shoot like 40% on those at least to even potentially affect that. And I think although that's like the extreme end of things, I really do think that Mitch Johnson is going to, while he may not say that he'd rather dive than close out on Josh Hart's 3-point shots, I think that in effect, that's what we'll see. So I'm really curious what's going to happen in this dynamic and kind of what's going to be exposed, because this is going to be the closest that either team is getting to a playoff environment, a playoff dynamic, and teams are going to break out strategies that they would in that environment. And we're going to see how teams respond, and we're going to see how Josh Hart responds. And if he can hurt them, again, like you said, not only in shooting and making threes, but in other ways that he can really damage them on the offensive boards and other things as well. And one quick thing, I was talking about the Celtics being, and Joe Mazzulla being like the greatest and most, steadfast at playing this ghost coverage against Josh Hart. They've always had guys who do it exceptionally well as well. And Al Horford and Luke Cornett, and Luke Cornett is on the San Antonio Spurs as well. So that to me is, aside from the Knicks standpoint, at least, aside from perimeter defense on the other end, that's going to be the biggest problem to solve.
If you're a Spurs fan who, for whatever reason, you just don't have a memory of this game, or you didn't watch this game, and go watch Game 5 of the Knicks-Celtics series last season. The Knicks went up 3-1 after a big win at Madison Square Garden. Jason Tatum, everyone remembers Jason Tatum tearing his Achilles in Game 4. A lot of people just assumed series over. No Tatum. The Knicks have all the momentum back. It doesn't even matter that it's playing Boston. Go watch Luke Cornett's performance in Game 5 of that series, because it was just exactly what XJ is talking about. Like, it was extremely dominant. That's what Luke Cornett can do. And I mean, I don't think I need to sing Luke Cornett's praises, because if you watched tonight's game, you heard Stan Van Gundy gush about the guy for the entire game. So just maybe Van Gundy got a little carried away, but Cornett can be super impactful. And you look at Josh Hart's like his metrics, and one of the things you see is his usage is like 16% the last couple seasons with the Knicks. Now, I don't think usage is like a super important stat at all, but one thing it is relevant to here in this discussion is it does kind of reflect how often he is in the primary action. And so you have a large majority of possessions where Josh Hart is not in the primary action. He is watching Jalen Brunson. He is cutting. He is setting screens off the ball. He is doing other things other than finishing the play. And what that tells us is that if you allow Victor Wembanyama, the league's best defender, and definitely the highest ceiling defender in the entire NBA, if you allow him to be the super maximized version of himself on 80% of the possessions with no punishment, you are having a negative impact. So this is where Josh Hart needs to counteract what the Spurs are already trying to counteract in terms of loading up on Jalen Brunson, making it less likely that OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges get to the rim, removing Karl-Anthony Towns' spacing impact offensively by making it easier to hedge on him, because, hey, if you need a hedge, you can hedge from this area of the court. All these things are happening from this one guy. He needs to counter that, and he needs to prove he can do it in a matchup like this. And again, there's no better matchup to prove he can do it because this is the gold standard of the ghost coverage. Victor Wembanyama, he is if you can somewhat counteract what Victor Wembanyama is going to do in terms of this ghost coverage, there's not a team in the league, including the Joe Mazzulla-led Celtics, that in theory you can't do it against.
100%. I agree. I love how you frame that, because I do think this is that situation for the Knicks, and they're going to find out so much information. And in some ways, although I was particularly excited about seeing OKC versus New York, those being the two teams I've watched the most over the past maybe 4 years. I'm from the standpoint of like meaning in terms of what you can take away from this game and what you're going to learn as a Knicks audience, and from an analyst standpoint, this is probably as good as it gets for the reasons that you described. I think from my kind of last thoughts here is like, we talked a lot about what is going to be or maybe struggles from the Knicks end and ways that they may try to circumvent those things. From the Spurs end, how would they slow down, and how do they plan to slow down Jalen Brunson, who, as you mentioned, he is not going to be one of these players who's subject to the Victor Wembanyama effect defensively of you can't get to the rim because, and I know you'd like to, but you have no chance to. Jalen Brunson probably has a very, as little an interest as getting all the way to the rim as any elite scorer in the NBA. He wants to get to that short mid-range, or that mid range, if you will, and makes those shots just about as good as anybody in the league, like you mentioned. When it comes to who his contemporaries might be, it's SGA and it's Luka Doncic. So how are you stopping or slowing down Jalen Brunson, especially when Karl-Anthony Towns is on the court? If the Knicks do happen to recognize some limitations with Josh Hart, and they put a guy who has better spacing gravity, like a Yabusele or someone like that, how are you stopping Jalen Brunson from getting to his spots and just destroying you, as he has been doing of late? And to be honest, if you haven't checked his offensive EPM of late, it's up there with some of the highest of his entire career this season, just from an offensive standpoint. And I think that does reflect in how he's played so far in terms of being able to move the ball more effectively, being a better quality passer, and still scoring with elite effectiveness from all three, locations on the court, especially from the mid range. So how will the Spurs deal with that?
Well, it's going to start a lot with what we just talked about in terms of like the idea of ghost coverage isn't just, oh, we're going to stick Wemby on the block and he just stands there. The reason what the Celtics do is so effective is because it's sort of an all hands on deck situation. If there's a hedge to be made, if there's a switch to be made, if there's a rotation, a pre-rotation, a stun, it's all coming from one place. And that's not one player. It's whoever is closest to the guy that you're fine living with. And so I think that's where the Spurs will start. And to be honest, I do think they'll do a lot of the same things that they were able to do against SGA and the Thunder, because there isn't someone on the Thunder that you're really like, oh, like they're on a relative basis. Of course, there is a worse shooter, but it isn't as drastic as it is in the Knicks situation, where like you're just like, okay, yeah, like we're going to make him prove that tonight's his night where he's going to beat us. And still, like I said earlier, the Spurs were in SGA's, up into him, making him take shots that aren't his favorite shots, and they at least made it difficult on him. I can see a world where you have Castle, who's a really good defender. I can see a world where Brunson gets him into foul trouble with his just sort of just how freaking tricky he is. Like I can just see Castle's so aggressive. He's young. I could see him falling for that. But I could also see a world where if it's reffed similarly to how this OKC Spurs game was, where the refs kind of just let him play, Castle's physical at the point of attack, I could see them having a similar effect on Brunson in terms of, if Brunson's making a shot, he's going to beat you, but at least we're going to make you take the shots we want you to take. I want to throw something back to you to just sort of put a bow on this episode, because you talked about what, from the Spurs advantage, what are things they might struggle with? And you bring up Brunson. I think it's fair to bring up Brunson. He's their best offensive player. But what makes the Spurs kind of strange or unique throughout the league is they're this big team because they have Wembanyama and Cornet. These are two like big rim protecting centers. They give you a lot of size, and I mean, shit, the fact that they can play together sometimes, that's even scarier. But when there's just one of them on the court, you have a center and you have a pretty small 1 through 4, especially at 4. Harrison Barnes plays a lot of 4. Sometimes Champagny plays a lot of 4. Sohan didn't play a minute against OKC. And you combine that with, okay, we're going to put Wembanyama and Josh Hart, and we're going to deploy ghost coverage. Well, who does that leave to guard Towns and OG Anunoby? I think that's the point where the Spurs really, really are going to be asked to. I think that's where they're going to have to help even more than Jalen Brunson. If I'm the coach of the Spurs, I at least to start the game see how the guys are doing one-on-one on Jalen Brunson. You make an adjustment if Brunson's just having one of those nights where he's cooking you. But if I'm telling Wembanyama, like, where are you going to help off of Josh Hart and look to help more? It's against Towns on these drives against these smaller wings. It's somebody hedging above the break, maybe contesting stopping Towns from just shooting over the wing that's on him. To me, that's the place where the Spurs could really get buried in this game because, yes, we talked about the trickle-down effects earlier and the weird ways that gravity show their heads. Yes, Josh Hart's existence on the court does let Wembanyama stay close to the rim, affect the rim in that way. But it also takes a center off of Karl-Anthony Towns, and that can be good for the Knicks, and it could be detrimental for the Spurs.
It's funny because I feel like how I'm thinking about Towns in this game is how you are thinking about Brunson in this game, and how you're thinking about Brunson in this game is how I'm thinking about Towns in this game. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The Knicks played the Hornets recently, and for a little bit, Charles Lee went to this lineup where, his bigs were Tijan Salon and Miles Bridges, and either of them were guarding Karl-Anthony Towns, and Karl-Anthony Towns completely had his way with both of them. And I thought that was so important. And because from the league-wide standpoint, I think that teams have gotten really, really comfortable with saying like, oh, we'll just put our wing on Towns. That's the solution. You just put a wing on Towns and you got it taken care of. It's as simple as that. And it's like, no, you don't just put a wing on Towns. You put a wing on Towns and you better have a rim protector under there as well. You need that second line of defense. You don't just put a wing on Towns and say, cool, and our rim protector is Tijan Salon. Like, no, that's not going to work. He's going to put Miles Bridges underneath the rim and dunk on his head if you just have him guarded by a guy who's undersized. He's too big and strong and powerful attacking the rim. So I don't think that would work. But at the same time, I think that it's enough to put Harrison Barnes on Karl-Anthony Towns, to put, even if you don't have two bigs on the court, if Wembanyama is sitting, to put Luke Cornett on Karl-Anthony Towns, to put Julian Champagny on Karl-Anthony Towns, if you have that rim protector lurking, especially with Josh Hart on the court. And that's where Josh Hart's presence really pulls away from Towns' effectiveness in my eyes. If you have another shooter and you can't load up on Towns, now you have a problem on the Spurs end. But if you have a guy who can babysit the rim, and I think that the fact is that for Jalen Brunson, it feels like less of a deterrent because Jalen Brunson doesn't need to get all the way to the rim. Karl-Anthony Towns isn't taking short mid-rangers. Karl-Anthony Towns is going all the way to the rim, or he is shooting threes primarily. Jalen Brunson is the one who can live on that in-between game, and that's why I think it's slightly less effective coverage against him. But against Towns, if you can have a guy kind of babysit the rim defensively, and you can put a wing on him to kind of slow him down and make him take shots over the top, although his shot has been coming around of late, he hasn't been crushing from three, especially contested three. So I think you kind of live with that. I don't feel like it's as scary as it is, or as much of a problem for the Spurs as Jalen Brunson will be. But obviously we'll see. So that's just to respond to what you were saying. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I do think that it is a more theoretical concept because Towns, the 3-point gunner, has to this point mostly been theoretical. For whatever reason, he doesn't seem to want to launch threes at a rate unless maybe he has it going. Like a couple of years ago, he scored over 50 in Minnesota and he was just stepping into these deep threes. You just don't see it that often, despite being such a wonderful shooter. I do think, though, that there are levels to how small a wing you can put on him, to the point where Towns doesn't have to get to the rim as much, and he can live with, I agree with you. He's not going to be like a mid-range all-star, but he can, get down on the low block a little bit and not rely so heavily on those pump and go line drives to the rim, where Wemby will just be waiting and just eat him for lunch for the most part. Like, that's just, and Towns is so funny. Like, he'll just keep trying. He's like oh man. And maybe he'll get Wemby a time or two. Wemby's not impenetrable, or maybe he is. But I think, in terms of a practical perspective and just like how the game will actually be played Tuesday night, I think I agree with you that Brunson and the way he gets to his spots is probably more likely to force the Spurs to slightly reconsider the way they're defending him, as opposed to just like Towns all of a sudden taking Harrison Barnes into the low post, and like, they're going to live with those with Wemby waiting on the weak side. So I guess what I'm saying is that, while I agree with you, I do think that there is a world where Towns uses his size advantage more on the perimeter, and that hurts them more, because no matter what you think of Jalen Brunson, I don't think the Spurs are going to like just casually let Jalen Brunson walk into pull-up threes. Like, that's going to be a big part of this defense. They're going to be waiting with hedges. But when you stick an undersized wing like Champagnie or Barnes on Towns, he can just shoot over you. And I do think that that's something that could be a way that they count the Knicks as on the whole counteract the Spurs sticking Wembanyama on Hart.
All really great points. And hopefully, if you're listening to this and you got all the way to this point, you got something to get out. You got something out of this episode where you can watch the game and have a lot of things to have in your mind all simultaneously to watch out for. Because I think maybe, if not all, most of these concepts that we talked about are going to be really, really important themes in this game, because strategically, these are all really the linchpins of both teams' approach and the way that they're going to try to attack the other team. So if you agree with what we said, we'd love to hear about it. If you disagree with what we said, we'd love to hear your comments and say and hear what you actually think is the biggest thing to watch out for, what you think we missed in terms of really critical, strategic, or tactical, or even narrative-based, storylines that we should watch out for going into this game. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment. We respond to every single comment that ever comes in on this channel, so we'd love to hear from you and engage. And for Geoff, I'm XJ. We're looking a lot forward to this NBA Cup Finals. I think we're going to learn a lot about both teams. For Geoff, I'm XJ, and this has been Hot Hand Theory.